Inspector Pewbright arrived in Harrowby Cross under conditions that, while unremarkable, were ideal for the leisurely scrutiny he preferred. A late afternoon of thin sunlight, snow still clinging to the hedgerows, and a wind sufficiently gentle to carry the village into a kind of static repose. The station master, a small man with spectacles that had evidently never seen a washcloth, handed over the porter's luggage with a curt nod, remarking that the weather might make things interesting. Pewbright smiled faintly at the phrase, neither encouraging nor dismissive, and observed the gleam of snow on the platform roof. Even from this minor elevation, the village seemed held in a delicate suspension, every chimney silent save for occasional tendrils of smoke that suggested domestic preoccupations. There was, he noted, a peculiar alacrity in the greetings of the few villagers who had ventured to the station, a mixture of habitual civility and anticipatory scrutiny that he had learned to read with great advantage. Mrs. Ethel Grimshaw's cottage was situated at the northern periphery, where the road narrowed into a lane bordered by untrimmed hedges and the occasional frost-furred garden statue. The widow herself received him at the door, her figure small, her coat clasped with a meticulousness bordering on ritual. She inclined her head, offering a polite, if not particularly warm, smile. "Inspector Pewbright," she said, "you are welcome, though the snow has, well, it may make your visit a trifle inconvenient." Pewbright accepted the introduction with his usual calm, his eyes flicking momentarily to the doorframe, to the glint of a teapot on the nearby hall table, and to a pile of unopened letters, each with its top corner sharply creased, as if the act of folding had been more significant than the contents. Tea was offered in the parlor, where furniture had been arranged not for comfort, but for appearance. A rug of subdued pattern suggested diligence rather than taste, and the curtains were drawn so evenly that one could imagine an unspoken competition for domestic precision. Conversation commenced with a series of remarks about the weather, the condition of the lane, and the scarcity of snowplows, a conventional triad to be expected in such circumstances. Pewbright's observations, however, were more precise. Mrs. Grimshaw's eyes lingered just a moment too long on the corner of the hearth. The maid's hands trembled ever so slightly as she poured the tea, and there was an unaccountable hum in the radiator that punctuated moments of silence with the faint suggestion of tension. The village's social calendar had already begun to impose itself upon the conversation. Mrs. Grimshaw, with measured civility, mentioned the upcoming parish committee meeting. "It would be a pleasure to see you there, Inspector," she said, "though I am not certain you would find it particularly illuminating." Pewbright, with the faintest raise of an eyebrow, replied only that he had long found local assemblies to be quietly revealing in ways that mattered more than the stated business. The widow inclined her head, evidently amused and apprehensive in equal measure, and returned to stirring her tea with a teaspoon that tapped rhythmically against the porcelain. As the afternoon progressed, the conversation shifted to more personal matters, though never in ways that suggested impropriety. The topic of Mrs. Grimshaw's health, delicately broached by Pewbright, elicited measured denials. "I am as well as any woman my age might expect to be," she said, though perhaps less robust than is becoming for my household duties. The phrasing, careful and polite, nonetheless contained a subtle implication that she had been observed or evaluated, as if the social surveillance of Harrowby Cross extended even to minor bodily infirmities. Pewbright noted this without comment, recognizing the familiar pattern of modesty serving as both shield and indictment within the village hierarchy. By mid-afternoon, other villagers began to drift past the widow's cottage under the guise of casual visits, though the underlying purpose seemed invariably tied to the careful monitoring of her affairs. Mr. Bromley, a retired headmaster, appeared first, ostensibly to inquire after her well-being, but with a visible tension in the shoulders that betrayed minor grievances long harbored. He spoke at length of parish business, the management of small charitable funds, and the anticipated snow's effect upon the upcoming winter festival, yet never quite addressed the widow directly beyond perfunctory inquiries. Pewbright, attending silently, noted that Bromley's hands, clasped behind his back, shifted repeatedly from right to left, a subtle but unmistakable gesture of nervous control. Later, Miss Cartwright, the vicar's niece, arrived under the pretext of delivering a freshly typed report of the parish newsletter. Her movements were precise, her glances measured, and the faint scent of lavender suggested a desire to cultivate a particular impression. She spoke in clipped sentences, careful to mention the welfare of the widow, while discreetly observing every domestic detail. Pewbright perceived the underlying anxiety. Each comment was a test, each compliment an assertion of social authority. The widow's polite responses seemed to amuse her, though with the caution of one who is aware that any misstep might be recalled and weighed by the community. It was in these quiet interludes, as the snow fell softly beyond the window panes, that Pewbright noticed the first hints of discrepancy. Letters lying on the mantelpiece bore postmarks from a variety of correspondence, yet none were addressed to the same date or occasion, and several envelopes had been bent as if deliberately to obscure prior sorting. A ledger, half concealed beneath the tablecloth, revealed entries in a handwriting unfamiliar to the widow. The implications were small and subtle, yet sufficient to suggest that someone, perhaps more than one, had been quietly manipulating appearances, and that the conventional civility of the village might conceal active interference in domestic affairs. As evening approached, the widow's maid, a pale young woman with an expression of habitual timidity, offered a brief aside about visitors she could not name. "They come, Inspector," she said, "though they do not always say what they mean." Pewbright made a discreet note, recognizing the potential import of a statement couched in such deliberate ambiguity. The faint scent of coal smoke mingled with tea, and the air seemed to thicken with unspoken observation. Here, in the ordinary domesticities of Harrowby Cross, reputational anxiety and silent suspicion were taking shape, a pattern that would require both patience and discernment to unravel. Before retiring, Pewbright walked the perimeter of the widow's cottage, noting the tracks left by visitors, servants, and himself in the softening snow. Footprints diverged and converged with subtle precision, hinting at encounters unseen and exchanges unspoken. The wind whispered through bare branches, carrying an indistinct murmur from the village beyond, and for a moment he allowed himself the rare luxury of reflection. The outward calm of the village, its neatly kept hedges, and the polite gestures of its residents belied a subtle, pervasive anxiety, a network of observation, small offenses, and understated manipulation that demanded recognition. As he closed the gate and returned indoors, Pewbright's eyes fell upon a folded sheet of paper tucked behind a vase of winter blooms. The envelope was unmarked, the handwriting formal yet slightly uneven, and the words within were courteous, circumspect, and quietly insinuating. They suggested concern for Mrs. Grimshaw's welfare, yet hinted at a third party's unspoken oversight, a silent question about propriety and intention. Pewbright allowed the note to remain where it lay, resisting the impulse to read further. He sensed that the day's encounters, measured in civility and observation, had already begun to reveal the village's concealed dynamics, and in the half-light of the snowbound evening, he permitted himself the faintest inclination to suspect that what appeared as ordinary domesticity might, in fact, conceal a subtle and deliberate orchestration, a quiet complication that would unfold, with gentle precision, in the days to come. The parish committee convened that afternoon in the small hall behind St. Cuthbert's, a room notable for its polished floors, stiff-backed chairs, and a faint aroma of recently waxed pews carried in from the church. Inspector Pewbright arrived quietly, noticing immediately the faintly artificial air of civility that seemed to hover above the assembled members, as if politeness had been measured in advance and allotted to each participant in carefully portioned doses. Mrs. Grimshaw, who had insisted on accompanying him, sat slightly apart, her hands folded in her lap, offering nods of encouragement to individuals she had known for decades, but whose motives she now seemed to scrutinize as cautiously as her own tea leaves. The meeting opened with a procedural flourish. Mr. Bromley, the retired headmaster, read aloud the minutes of the previous gathering, pronouncing each name with meticulous clarity and pausing ever so slightly when reference was made to financial allocations that might have been contentious. The others nodded at intervals, though the nods themselves varied from perfunctory to conspicuously eager, as if each participant were subtly asserting loyalty or dissent through gesture alone. Pewbright, seated near the back, allowed his gaze to flit over these interactions, noting the social hierarchies etched in posture and manner rather than words. It was remarkable how little could be communicated through simple orientation of the body. The slight lowering of a gaze, the careful avoidance of eye contact. Discussion turned to the forthcoming Christmas fete, which the committee had long prepared with diligence bordering on ceremonial obsession. On the surface, the conversation was trivial: tables, decorations, and a schedule of musical performances. But Pewbright discerned in the phrasing of certain comments an underlying contest of influence. The treasurer, Mr. Smallwood, spoke cautiously of budgetary restrictions, yet his glances toward Miss Cartwright betrayed a desire to assert interpretive authority over the committee's decisions. Miss Cartwright, for her part, replied with precise deference, yet her clipped phrasing suggested she was subtly reframing the discussion to favor her own objectives, and the faint crease between her brows was the only sign of conscious calculation. The matter of Mrs. Grimshaw's charitable contribution, mentioned with a polite preamble, stirred the first noticeable undercurrent of tension. It was done delicately, it has been suggested, Bromley intoned, that the widow's recent generosity might benefit those among us most, but he trailed off as though even the implication were perilous to pronounce fully. Miss Cartwright added, with a formal civility that masked calculation, that any distribution should consider previous contributions, past engagements, and reputational merit. The room for a moment fell into a kind of suspended judgment. Pewbright observed the manner in which the committee members exchanged small glances, noting how the unspoken consensus, who ought to benefit, who ought not, hung invisibly in the air, pressing upon each participant like the weight of unvoiced accusations. A minor dispute arose, ostensibly over the wording of a letter to be included in the village newsletter. Words were debated: assist versus support, consider versus recommend. It was a small skirmish in which no one raised their voice, yet the precision of the argument betrayed unacknowledged friction. Pewbright smiled inwardly at the familiar choreography. In Harrowby Cross, every minor semantic choice was a potential declaration of alliance or dissent. Mrs. Grimshaw, observing quietly, displayed a faint twitch at the corner of her mouth, as though noting who among her acquaintances preferred the ostentation of propriety over the subtleties of truth. The treasurer, Mr. Smallwood, inadvertently introduced an element of curiosity by referring to a ledger entry that had apparently been misfiled. He mentioned it as a clerical oversight, yet his careful avoidance of specifying the nature of the misfiling did not escape Pewbright. The entries in question concerned small expenditures and donations, none of them significant in monetary terms, but potentially telling in their pattern. Pewbright, noting the habitual nervousness with which the treasurer adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat, suspected that the ledger contained more than simple errors. The pattern of omissions and repetitions suggested careful, deliberate management of appearances. Mrs. Grimshaw's presence, although nominally passive, exerted a subtle influence on the proceedings. Her mere attendance encouraged those whose conduct was least defensible to maintain an exaggerated decorum. It was noticeable, too, that certain individuals, upon meeting her gaze, altered their posture in ways almost imperceptible but revealing: a straightening of the back, a suppression of a habitual frown, the sudden adjustment of gloves. Pewbright recorded these phenomena with quiet amusement. The village had its own grammar of guilt, and every minor gesture served as punctuation in the ongoing narrative of communal surveillance. The meeting drifted naturally toward discussion of parish correspondence. including letters that had arrived in the past fortnight. Pewbright was particularly attentive to the accounts of Miss Cartwright, who read aloud passages from letters regarding contributions, complaints, and requests for intervention. The letters themselves were courteous to the point of fawning, yet the choice of words, the careful phrasing, and the conspicuous absence of certain addressees spoke volumes about priorities and omissions. Pewbright noted that even the ordering of topics, what was mentioned first, what was delayed, was orchestrated with deliberate subtlety. The underlying motive, he sensed, was to assert control over narrative rather than action, and to shape perception without ever overtly infringing upon it. A sudden, nearly imperceptible incident provided a further clue. Miss Cartwright, reaching for a document, allowed it to slide slightly from her hand, revealing an annotation in a handwriting distinctly different from her own. She quickly replaced it, her expression politely neutral. Yet the brief exposure suggested the presence of another influence within the committee's otherwise carefully choreographed proceedings. Pewbright's eyes narrowed at the subtle revelation. It was the sort of minor detail that might easily be dismissed by any observer less attuned to the nuances of village politeness. Yet here lay a trace of intervention, evidence that appearances had been curated, and perhaps curated for reasons unknown. By mid-afternoon, the discussion shifted towards scheduling visits to the widow's cottage to discuss practical matters of support and oversight. The proposed visits, while ostensibly benign, carried with them an invisible hierarchy. Those with greater social authority would attend first, thereby reinforcing a subtle chain of observation. The committee members discussed logistics with the utmost civility, yet each phrase, each measured pause, served to assert influence and test compliance. Pewbright found the orchestration fascinating, recognizing in it the same pattern of social vigilance he had observed in other small communities. He made a note to review the timing of visits against the ledger entries, suspecting that minor inconsistencies might illuminate previously concealed interactions. The meeting concluded with the customary expressions of thanks, polite gestures of mutual regard, and cautious goodbyes. Mrs. Grimshaw departed quietly, accompanied by Pewbright, whose eyes lingered briefly on the lingering expressions of anxiety and self-consciousness among the committee members. Even in their outward civility, he detected a shared apprehension, the acknowledgement that the widow's welfare and the perception thereof was now, in part, their responsibility. In the narrow lane outside the hall, snow had begun to settle more firmly, muting the footsteps of departing members and leaving the village in an almost meditative hush. As Pewbright and Mrs. Grimshaw returned toward her cottage, he observed the maid moving carefully along the path, carrying parcels that seemed trivial yet deliberately arranged. The young woman's glances suggested she, too, had noticed the unspoken tensions and hierarchies within the committee. In the half-light, a small pale envelope caught Pewbright's attention, tucked beneath a loose slate by the doorstep. It bore no postmark, no name, only a faint impression of handwriting that appeared formal yet intentionally hesitant. The note itself was brief, courteous, and indirect, hinting at minor improprieties and unspoken observations concerning the widow's domestic arrangements. Pewbright did not read it immediately, yet its presence left him with a subtle question. Had the village, in its polite deliberations, begun to manipulate circumstances around Mrs. Grimshaw with a quiet deliberation masked by civility? He allowed the question to linger, recognizing that the slow accumulation of observation, of nuanced behavior, and of silent implication would prove more illuminating than any immediate confrontation. In Harrowby Cross, he reflected, the truth rarely announced itself. It emerged in gestures, omissions, and carefully managed appearances. And as the wind drifted through the hedgerows, carrying with it the faint echo of committee deliberations and the scent of burning coal, Pewbright sensed that the first layers of subtle manipulation had already begun to reveal themselves. Quietly, insistently, in the spaces between words. The snow had deepened overnight, covering the lanes of Harrowby Cross with a deceptive evenness that belied the subtle fissures of social tension beneath. By mid-morning, the village had fallen into an unplanned, almost monastic isolation. Chimneys smoked faintly, windows glinted with frost, and the occasional figure traversed the pathways with the cautious deliberation of those who feared both the weather and their neighbours' scrutiny. Inspector Pewbright, observing from the widow Grimshaw's parlour window, noted how the snow rendered familiar patterns simultaneously legible and deceptive. Footprints suggested routine, yet diverged in ways that hinted at meetings, detours, and perhaps unnoticed interventions. He was joined briefly by Mrs. Grimshaw, who offered tea with the same precision as the previous day. Her movements, though measured, betrayed a slight agitation as she fussed with a napkin, arranging and rearranging it in a deliberate pattern. "The snow has made things peculiar," she said lightly, though her tone carried the faintest tremor of worry. "One does not know who is able to visit, and yet one feels observed." Pewbright inclined his head. "Observation, Mrs. Grimshaw, rarely ceases in villages such as ours," he said, with the detached humor that always accompanied his social commentary. "One must note not only who arrives but who abstains, and how abstention is explained." It was precisely this attention to absences that guided his next inquiries. Pewbright began visiting neighbours in sequence, ostensibly under the pretext of checking on them during the snowbound spell. Each encounter was formal, punctuated with polite inquiries and carefully chosen compliments. Yet the real work lay in what was left unsaid, the hesitation before replying, the overly precise recounting of trivial events, the conscious avoidance of direct eye contact. Mrs. Cartwright, the vicar's niece, spoke of her own isolation in meticulous terms, citing hours devoted to knitting for the parish and proofreading newsletters. Her phrasing was correct to the point of stiffness, and when she mentioned an unplanned visit from a tradesman, her fingers brushed a folded corner of paper in a way that suggested nervous attention. Pewbright made a subtle mental note. The act of touching a document, especially one not immediately offered for inspection, was as informative as any confession. In contrast, Mr. Smallwood, the treasurer, allowed himself slightly more candor. He admitted, with a polite sigh, that the snow had disrupted deliveries and caused confusion in ledger entries. Yet even this admission was couched in an implicit defense, as if the mismanagement of parcels and letters could tarnish only his reputation, rather than the village's collective integrity. "It is curious," he said, adjusting his spectacles, "how much one notices when the world is confined. A missing envelope, a mislaid payment. One perceives patterns otherwise invisible." Pewbright, noting the tremor in Smallwood's left hand, recognized the familiar psychological economy of Harrowby Cross. Anxiety and moral pride, carefully interwoven, were frequently sufficient to prompt minor deceptions, often more revealing than overt falsehoods. The widow's maid contributed, in her understated way, another layer to the tableau. She recounted, in halting phrases, that certain villagers had called upon the cottage during the prior day, though she avoided naming them directly. "They come," she said, "and they speak in the parlour or the kitchen. They ask questions that are not quite questions." Pewbright allowed the remark to stand in the silence that followed, for it carried more weight than any explicit allegation. The observation, casually phrased, suggested an active surveillance that was both social and strategic. The maid's timidity did not obscure the fact that she had noticed something others might prefer to ignore, and her careful omission of names was itself a marker of local politeness and self-protection. The inspector next examined minor evidence of interaction, footprints in the snow, smudges along the gatepost, and the faint impression of gloves left upon doorknobs. Each was trivial when considered separately, but collectively they hinted at movements unaccounted for in verbal testimony. Pewbright traced them with measured steps, noting where they converged or avoided certain paths. The subtle divergences suggested meetings beyond those declared to Mrs. Grimshaw or the committee. Encounters, perhaps, whose purpose was to assess or influence, rather than simply to observe. The snow, by both isolating and revealing, magnified every minor discrepancy, rendering invisible alignments almost tangible. He also found that minor objects within the cottage had been subtly rearranged. A ledger that had rested beneath the tea tray was now atop the sideboard. The teaspoon previously observed to tap against the cup was missing, replaced by one that was ever so slightly shorter in handle. Pewbright, with dry amusement, observed that such trifles were precisely the sorts of signals villagers relied upon to manage appearances. He made a careful note. If someone had sought to create the impression of diligence or oversight, such minor changes were often a more reliable record of intent than any written account. In conversation with Mr. Bromley, the retired headmaster, Pewbright detected another thread of understated tension. Bromley spoke of parish committees, charitable distributions, and weather-related difficulties, yet his responses were punctuated by pauses that suggested unspoken calculation. At one point, Bromley allowed an almost imperceptible glance toward the mantelpiece, as though evaluating the arrangement of letters or the placement of the teapot. Pewbright caught the subtle flicker of recognition. Bromley's interest was not merely in the administrative minutiae, but in what the widow herself might reveal, whether inadvertently or under polite pressure. This was a hallmark of the village's psychological climate, interest expressed through indirect means, the measurement of intentions through observation rather than questioning. By late morning, the cumulative effect of interviews, observations, and document scrutiny had begun to form a pattern. Pewbright noted which villagers were overly cautious in their recounting of visits, which omitted trivial details, and which displayed the faintest signs of embarrassment when asked about routine interactions. Each omission, hesitation, or overcompensation contributed to a subtle but growing map of social influence, alliances, and anxiety. The snow, in preserving the village in a moment of isolation, had inadvertently made its hidden dynamics legible to one trained in observation and inference. A particularly delicate moment occurred when Miss Cartwright arrived unannounced, ostensibly to verify certain newsletter entries. She lingered longer than necessity dictated, glancing at ledgers, letters, and the arrangement of chairs in ways that were superficially curious, but upon inspection carried a subtext of surveillance. She commented on the neatness of the tea service, on the folding of napkins, and on the alignment of ledger columns. Her compliments were courteous, almost flattering, yet there was a subtle assertion of oversight, an implicit message that she was observing and evaluating. Pewbright, noting her gestures, realized that she had begun to manipulate even the domestic space as an instrument of social control. As the day waned, Pewbright returned briefly to the window, observing the tracks of departing visitors merging and vanishing in the soft snow. There was an almost imperceptible divergence, two sets of prints that suggested a meeting beyond the widow's notice, a conversation held in the margins of observation, carefully managed and largely invisible. The effect, he reflected, was to confirm the pattern he had begun to perceive. Social surveillance conducted with civility and discretion, minor manipulations of domestic routine, and the silent assertion of authority through presence rather than confrontation. It was then that Pewbright noticed a subtle but significant clue. Beneath the edge of the hearth rug, a folded scrap of paper protruded, slightly soiled, yet clearly distinct from other documents in the room. It bore a brief note in a handwriting that was formal, precise, and unfamiliar. The phrasing was courteous, almost deferential, yet it hinted at concern, minor discrepancies, and the suggestion of unobserved intervention. Pewbright did not read it immediately, preferring instead to allow its presence to circulate in his consciousness. Even without deciphering the text, the placement of the note was meaningful. Someone had intentionally left it in a location that would be noticed, yet not intrusively. It was a deliberate signal, subtle and layered, and its existence confirmed his suspicion that the outward tranquility of Harrowby Cross masked carefully orchestrated observation. As the afternoon drew to a close, the snow continued to fall, softening sounds and muting the movements of those still abroad. Within the cottage, the silence had grown layered. The ticking of the clock, the faint hiss of the radiator, and the occasional creak of floorboards underscored the weight of social observation. Pewbright reflected that the day's inquiries had revealed more through absence, gesture, and hesitation than through explicit statement. In Harrowby Cross, reputational anxiety and moral propriety operated with quiet insistence, shaping behavior as effectively as any edict. And so the chapter concluded with the faintest shift. A note, unclaimed yet deliberately placed, and the realization that beneath the village's polite exterior, forces of influence, observation, and subtle manipulation were at work. Forces that might soon intersect with Mrs. Grimshaw's own domestic routine, in ways both quiet and consequential. Pewbright, content for the moment to observe rather than intervene, allowed a single question to linger in his mind. Who had left the note, and for what purpose? The snow, now settling into deeper layers, seemed to suspend the answer, leaving it for later discernment, just as the village itself appeared to hold its secrets beneath a pristine and deceptive surface. The morning light in Harrowby Cross fell with a muted persistence, drifting across snow-laden rooftops and settling upon the widow Grimshaw's parlour in a manner that emphasized both stillness and observation. Inspector Pewbright, seated with his notebook open upon the table, examined the correspondence neatly arranged before him, letters that to the casual eye appeared prosaic and orderly, yet each bore the faint trace of social negotiation, deliberate ambiguity, or subtle assertion. Mrs. Grimshaw herself moved about the room with customary precision, arranging sugar bowls, folding napkins, and smoothing the creases of envelopes as though preparing each for inspection by some invisible tribunal. Pewbright began with the letters addressed to Mrs. Grimshaw from the local tradesman, who wrote with conventional deference and unobtrusive concern. They thanked her politely for past patronage, reminded her of overdue accounts, or requested the opportunity to supply small goods for the parish fefti. On the surface, the correspondence was banal. Beneath it, however, subtle deviations revealed themselves. One envelope bore a seal slightly misaligned. Another, though dated the same week as its counterpart, was written in ink of a marginally different shade. Pewbright, noting the discrepancies with meticulous care, reflected upon the village's penchant for signaling priorities and affiliations through the most seemingly minor gestures. A letter from the vicar arrived next, folded with exacting attention, its tone exemplary in courtesy, yet faintly pressing in contempt. The vicar inquired about the widow's willingness to sponsor an additional donation for the poor, couching the suggestion in phrases such as "if you would see fit" and "in consideration of your prior generosity." Pewbright detected the implicit weighting of expectation, an exercise in social leverage masquerading as deference. The widow responded with polite circumspection, emphasizing her own health, the weather, and the need for moderation, yet each carefully chosen phrase seemed to carry a subtle acknowledgement of oversight, both hers and that of the parish. Miss Cartwright's letters were another matter entirely. Typed with precise uniformity, they outlined upcoming parish meetings, requests for donations, and summaries of prior correspondence. Pewbright observed that her phrasing, while outwardly courteous, frequently implied judgment. One sentence suggested an unspoken disappointment in the widow's prior allocation of charitable funds, while another noted, with formal delicacy, that several residents had expressed concern over inconsistencies in oversight. The words were designed to convey neither accusation nor alarm. Instead, they functioned as instruments of reputational pressure, subtly guiding Mrs. Grimshaw toward compliance without overt direction. While reviewing the letters, Pewbright noted the presence of small annotations in pencil, likely made by Mrs. Grimshaw herself or, perhaps, by another observer. They consisted of initials, check marks, and brief comments. RS unclear, follow-up, questionable timing, all of which suggested that the act of reading was inseparable from assessment. Pewbright's attention to these marginalia was rewarded with the first hint of irregularity, an entry marked with the initials of an unknown correspondent, referencing a minor gift that had not been delivered nor acknowledged publicly. The detail was trivial, yet in Harrowby Cross, even trivialities carried potential significance, revealing the interplay of oversight, expectation, and concealed intent. A further layer of nuance presented itself in letters from more distant correspondents, relatives and acquaintances residing beyond the village. They wrote with affectionate propriety, commenting on the snow, the season, or Mrs. Grimshaw's health. Yet in each, a faint undertone suggested observation. Questions about who visited and when, inquiries as to the sequence of correspondence, and references to events in which the village had an interest. Pewbright, as ever, noted these subtleties with interest. The outward innocence of the communication was a fade behind which a quiet network of surveillance operated. Even distance did not dissolve accountability in Harrowby Cross. It merely relocated its mechanisms. It was the ledger, however, tucked beneath a folded newspaper, that offered the most immediate insight. Pewbright carefully examined the entries, noting that the records of donations, household expenses, and minor parish payments did not fully align with the dates indicated in letters. For example, a small contribution recorded as sent on the 3rd of the month appeared in a letter postmarked the 5th, and yet another gift, acknowledged in writing, lacked any entry in the ledger at all. Such incongruities were slight enough to escape casual observation, yet they revealed the precise type of selective disclosure that often characterized village behavior, the careful crafting of appearances to balance obligation, conscience, and reputation. Mrs. Grimshaw herself made no effort to conceal her anxiety regarding the letters. She expressed minor exclamations of doubt over dates and phrasing, noting politely that she feared misreading intention or overstating courtesy. "It is difficult," she said softly, "to distinguish between deference and expectation. One must tread carefully. Yet even caution seems to attract scrutiny." Pewbright allowed the remark to linger unacknowledged, making a note in his notebook. He had long observed that in small communities, the acknowledgement of anxiety was itself a social act, one that could subtly recalibrate hierarchies, elicit reassurance, or provoke intervention. The maid, summoned to retrieve a misplaced letter, offered an additional glimpse into the hidden landscape of domestic politics. She mentioned, without naming names, that some letters had been moved from their usual resting place, as though examined by a hand not immediately visible. Her tone was apologetic and restrained, yet Pewbright noted the combination of timidity and perceptiveness. She had witnessed the rearrangement and, in the act of reporting it, confirmed the ongoing operation of subtle oversight. The movement of letters, minor and almost imperceptible, suggested that control of information was a central preoccupation in the village, and that Mrs. Grimshaw's domestic sphere had become a locus for reputational influence. Late in the morning, the visitor most deliberately absent from prior discussion arrived at the doorstep, Mr. Bromley, the retired headmaster. His approach was formal, measured, and punctuated with glances at the snow-laden path, as though assessing who might have observed his passage. He inquired after Mrs. Grimshaw's health, discussed minor administrative matters, and finally, with polite discretion, alluded to a letter that had apparently been delayed in delivery. Bromley's phrasing was impeccable. His meaning, however, was not entirely veiled. Pewbright discerned the careful balancing of accountability and ambiguity. Bromley wished to signal awareness of the correspondence without implying fault or intrusion, an exercise in reputational subtlety that would have gone unnoticed by any but the most attentive observer. By afternoon, the accumulation of letters, annotations, and observations had produced a quiet sense of narrative. Each document, gesture, and minor discrepancy contributed to a portrait not of criminality, but of managed appearances. A village negotiating its moral obligations, reputations, and anxieties with meticulous attention. The snow continued to isolate the residents, and in doing so magnified the significance of each interaction, each subtle shift in phrasing, and each careful omission. The chapter concluded with a detail so slight that it might have been overlooked entirely. A folded corner of a letter, protruding from beneath the ledger, bore an impression not of the sender but of an intermediary, someone who had handled the correspondence without authorization. Pubright did not examine it immediately, recognizing the value of observation over intervention. The implication was modest yet compelling. The management of letters, and therefore of knowledge, was not solely Mrs. Grimshaw's responsibility. Another agent, discreet, deliberate, and invested in the outcomes of communication, had quietly asserted influence over the household. In Harrowby Cross, even a folded corner could carry the weight of social intention, and Pubright allowed a single, silent question to linger: who had handled the letters, and to what purpose? The afternoon arrived with a muted light that softened the sharp angles of the widow Grimshaw's parlour, lending the room a subdued clarity through which Inspector Pubright could examine social nuance with his customary attention. The tea had been prepared with fastidious care, a polished silver teapot, cups aligned with mathematical precision, and a plate of biscuits positioned so that no one could claim preferential access. Mrs. Grimshaw herself moved about with a gentle insistence upon order, her hands arranging and rearranging sugar tongs, as if each subtle adjustment might forestall some unseen transgression. Pubright, seated with notebook in hand, observed the interplay of civility, anxiety, and reputation that would unfold in what promised to be a deceptively ordinary gathering. The first visitor arrived promptly, Miss Cartwright, the vicar's niece, whose expression balanced curiosity and calculation. She seated herself with careful grace, offering polite inquiries about Mrs. Grimshaw's health before glancing toward the inspector, as though measuring the extent of his engagement in the household's routine. "The weather has made journeys quite difficult," she remarked, her tone impeccably neutral. "Though I trust all matters proceed as usual." Pubright noted the phrasing: neutral, deferential, yet subtly assertive, suggesting that oversight could be implied even in the absence of direct commentary. The observation of propriety, he reflected, was often more revealing than any outright statement. Mr. Bromley arrived next, carrying an air of composed authority that had long defined his place in the village hierarchy. His eyes lingered briefly on the alignment of furniture, the polished teapot, and the assortment of letters on the sideboard. "I trust the day finds you well, Mrs. Grimshaw," he said formally, though the snow might have imposed unanticipated burdens. Bromley's voice was gentle, yet Pubright discerned an undercurrent of scrutiny. The comment implied both acknowledgement of difficulty and subtle measurement of response. The widow's polite reply, "I am managing," though with some care, suggested her awareness of observation, a tacit agreement to participate in the choreography of propriety without overextension. Tea commenced, poured with deliberate smoothness, and conversation drifted toward the parish 50. Discussion of tables, schedules, and musical arrangements was conducted with courteous precision, yet each comment carried social weight. Miss Cartwright inquired delicately whether Mrs. Grimshaw had received any letters concerning the distribution of funds, prompting the widow to reference correspondence without divulging specifics. The manner in which she spoke, the careful phrasing, the brief pauses, the subtle hesitation before mentioning dates, revealed a consciousness of every listener present. Pubright noted that civility could, paradoxically, magnify suspicion, for each deliberate pause or measured phrase might conceal either omission or emphasis. Mr. Smallwood, the treasurer, contributed with a tone of gentle anxiety, observing the alignment of discussion and ledger entries. "It is possible, I suppose," he said, adjusting his spectacles, "that certain contributions have not yet been fully recorded, though I have relied upon my usual diligence." The phrasing, polite and self-effacing, hinted at concern for reputation as much as accuracy, and Pubright detected the underlying admission. Even minor clerical discrepancies carried the potential to disrupt perceived propriety. He observed the subtle interplay between anxiety and civility, noting the way in which the villagers' fear of reputational blemish influenced both their statements and their gestures. A small tension arose over the placement of the biscuits on the table. Miss Cartwright, moving a plate slightly, commented that the arrangement might allow better access for those seated farther from the teapot. Though trivial in content, the minor correction elicited slight stiffening among the other visitors, as if even domestic arrangement were a subtle arena of influence. Pewbright noted the microcosm of village politics in the exchange, the attempt to assert order, the measured resistance, the tacit recognition that civility could accommodate correction, but not overt dominance. The widow, observing silently, allowed the adjustment without comment, her composure registering subtle acknowledgement of social hierarchy while preserving her own authority. The discussion then moved to the timing of visits and deliveries. Miss Cartwright, with careful precision, enumerated the visits she had undertaken, the letters she had delivered, and the expected communications from other parish members. Bromley added his recollections, occasionally interjecting with phrases such as, "I believe a parcel may have arrived earlier than noted," leaving open the question of timing and oversight. Pewbright, listening quietly, began to cross-reference these statements with the ledger entries he had examined previously. The juxtaposition revealed minor discrepancies, dates that overlapped impossibly, letters acknowledged yet not recorded, visits implied but unconfirmed. Such deviations, though minor, suggested either innocent error or a subtle manipulation of appearances, and the distinction would require patient observation to discern. The maid, summoned to refresh the tea, contributed another layer of complexity. She mentioned, almost apologetically, that certain letters had been moved, though she could not recall by whom or for what purpose. Pewbright allowed the remark to remain in the air. The hesitation, the uncertainty, and the casual phrasing all spoke more clearly than a direct assertion might have. The presence of an unacknowledged intermediary in the handling of correspondence added weight to the subtle inconsistencies in timing and placement he had observed earlier. Here was an invisible influence operating within domestic routine, shaping perception without overt interference. Midway through the gathering, a minor, almost imperceptible incident occurred. As Miss Cartwright reached for a ledger, the corner of a folded note slipped from beneath the page, revealing a few lines of penciled text. The words were formal, courteous, and indirect, a polite remark concerning Mrs. Grimshaw's household oversight, couched in language designed to avoid accusation while implying observation. She straightened the page with deliberate neutrality, but Pewbright's attention had caught the impression of intent. Someone had left a signal, subtle yet meaningful, that suggested surveillance and, perhaps, subtle influence on domestic affairs. The air of the room, while outwardly composed, had grown taut with observation. Each participant was simultaneously conscious of the other's scrutiny and careful to maintain appearances. Pewbright reflected that the tea gathering, though ostensibly mundane, functioned as a carefully regulated arena of social examination. The villagers were negotiating influence, monitoring compliance, and preserving reputational equilibrium, all under the guise of cordial hospitality. Even the selection of conversation topics, parish affairs, minor weather inconveniences, and domestic arrangements was governed by the unspoken calculus of propriety and vigilance. As the meeting concluded, Mrs. Grimshaw offered her customary thanks, her phrasing gentle, formal, and slightly wistful. The visitors departed with measured politeness, leaving behind a room in which every item, gesture, and arrangement retained the faint imprint of their presence. Pewbright, remaining briefly, examined the ledger once more and noted a small discrepancy, an entry indicating a visit or delivery that, according to his previous observations, had not occurred. The minor anomaly, trivial in isolation, suggested that some details had been consciously managed to maintain appearance, and that the subtle choreography of oversight extended beyond the immediate gathering. Finally, as the inspector prepared to step out and review the path back toward the main street, he noticed something almost imperceptible: a footprint in the thin snow beyond the gate. distinct from those of the departing visitors. It suggested a presence at the cottage that had not been formally recorded. Someone whose motives, timing, and observations remained unknown. The mark was small, almost innocuous. Yet in the quiet architecture of Harrowby Cross, such evidence carried the weight of intent. Pewbright allowed himself a faint smile, noting that the village's reputational network had already begun to reveal its hidden dimensions. And so the chapter closed on the softest of shifts. An unclaimed footprint, a folded note, a ledger entry misaligned with known visits. All minor details that, in aggregation, hinted at deliberate orchestration within the otherwise tranquil confines of Mrs. Grimshaw's domestic sphere. Pewbright understood, with his usual calm precision, that the day's observations had revealed patterns, yet withheld answers. The question remained, silent and persistent, who had been at the cottage unobserved, and what subtle influence had they exercised in the shadows of civility? The morning air in Harrowby Cross carried a brittle clarity, the snow-crusted lane reflecting sunlight in a way that accentuated both the quaintness and the vigilance of the village. Inspector Pewbright, walking deliberately toward the center of town, observed how the few pedestrians navigated the pathways with careful awareness of both footing and neighbors' eyes. Every gesture, hand adjusting a scarf, tilt of the head, slight shift of pace, spoke to a culture in which observation and reputation were inseparable. Even absent overt malice, the village maintained a quiet orchestration of propriety, where the smallest infraction, or the mere suggestion of one, could carry social consequence. Pewbright's first interview that morning was with Mr. Smallwood, the treasurer, who received him in his modest sitting room with a civility tempered by visible apprehension. "I trust you found the weather manageable on your way here," Smallwood remarked, adjusting his spectacles with precision. The phrasing, courteous yet measured, conveyed both deference and a subtle wish to frame the conversation within known boundaries. Pewbright accepted the courtesy without comment, his attention drawn to the ledger open upon the table. Smallwood spoke of parish records, the timing of deliveries, and the recent arrival of letters with an overemphasis on clarity that suggested both defensiveness and an acute awareness of oversight. The inspector probed gently, asking about the sequence of visits to the widow's cottage, referencing days and times noted in the ledger. Smallwood's initial responses were exact, almost rehearsed, yet inconsistencies began to surface in his phrasing. A minor hesitation here, a repeated clarification there. Each small deviation from strict chronology hinted at memory filtered through anxiety. Pewbright, observing quietly, recognized the familiar calculus. Fear of reputational lapse could manifest as minor temporal distortions, even in individuals of impeccable training and intention. The subtleties of speech, pauses, syllable emphasis, and the careful avoidance of direct affirmation often revealed more than a direct admission could. Next, Pewbright visited Mrs. Cartwright, the vicar's niece, whose sitting room was arranged with symmetrical precision, a physical manifestation of the social order she so diligently maintained. She offered tea, seated herself with rigid posture, and spoke with measured neutrality about parish activities. When questioned about recent visits to the widow, she enumerated them with exact dates and times, yet each detail was delivered with a cadence that implied anticipation of correction or challenge. Pewbright noticed how her gaze flicked repeatedly to a calendar hanging just beyond the fireplace, as though verifying her memory against an external record. The care in her phrasing suggested a consciousness not only of what she had done, but of how she would be perceived in recounting it. The conversation shifted toward minor discrepancies in correspondence. Miss Cartwright, despite her meticulous records, acknowledged with a polite sigh that certain letters had been delayed or misplaced. Pewbright observed the subtle tension in her hands, which clasped and unclasped rhythmically upon her lap. The phrasing was intentionally indirect. She did not admit responsibility, nor accuse any specific party, yet the choice of words, delayed, misplaced, unaccounted for, implied observation and potential intervention by another. Pewbright noted the layering of ambiguity. The village communicated through implication, with truth, omission, and suggestion intertwined in polite phrasing. In the course of questioning, Pewbright discerned an intriguing incongruity. While both Smallwood and Cartwright confirmed their own visits to the widow's cottage, their accounts of the same time period diverged in minor but significant ways. Smallwood recalled certain letters being handled on the afternoon of the second day, while Cartwright maintained they had been managed the following morning. Both presented their recollections with certainty, yet the mismatch suggested either inadvertent error or deliberate management of appearance. Pewbright, noting their unwavering politeness, realized that either possibility was equally plausible in a community vigilant of its own proprieties. A brief visit to Mr. Bromley provided additional nuance. The retired headmaster received Pewbright with customary courtesy, his posture impeccably formal, his voice measured. He spoke at length about minor parish business, the snow's impact on deliveries, and the anticipated arrival of correspondence from outlying relatives. Yet, when questioned about his own visits to the widow, Bromley's account was punctuated by pauses and indirect references. He mentioned being in the vicinity or present at intervals, leaving precise times undefined. Pewbright detected the deliberate vagueness, a strategy common among villagers when reconciling duty, observation, and reputation. Bromley's careful ambiguity suggested that he, too, was cognizant of potential judgment, preferring impression management over strict chronological accuracy. Returning to the widow's cottage by late morning, Pewbright examined the ledger and letters once more. Small details emerged, letters annotated with pencil marks that did not correspond to known handwriting, ledger entries lacking matching dates in the postmark, and small impressions suggesting documents had been moved or handled outside regular oversight. Pewbright noted the cumulative effect. Minor irregularities, each trivial alone, collectively painted a picture of subtle orchestration. Social influence was exercised through observation and indirect action rather than overt intervention. Yet the pattern of discrepancies implied deliberate manipulation. The maid, who had been quietly attending to domestic tasks, offered another observation. She mentioned seeing a figure near the back gate the previous afternoon, a presence unaccounted for by any visitor's itinerary. Her description was tentative, almost apologetic, yet informative. The person had not called upon the widow formally, had left no letter, and appeared attentive to movements inside the house without intrusion. Pewbright regarded the account seriously. Even a fleeting, indirect observation might illuminate the otherwise invisible network of influence at work in Harrowby Cross. The village, he reflected, operated as a system of constant oversight, and the smallest deviation from expectation was potentially significant. Tea was served once again, and the inspector's attention lingered on the placement of cups, spoons, and folded napkins. Each item, arranged and adjusted with deliberate precision, testified to the household's awareness of both visitors and observation. Pewbright noted the interplay between domestic order and social expectation. Even seemingly trivial objects could function as instruments of subtle signaling. The villagers, aware of one another's scrutiny, extended influence through gestures as minor as the tilt of a cup or the fold of a letter. Social propriety, he reflected, was enforced through both presence and absence, through timing, phrasing, and the careful curation of appearances. The chapter concluded with the softest of clues, a marginal pencil note, half hidden beneath a ledger, bore initials unrecognized by Pewbright, indicating a transaction or visit unrecorded elsewhere. The mark was subtle, yet its presence suggested unseen oversight, the quiet intervention of a party not accounted for in previous inquiries. Pewbright did not read the note immediately. Instead, he allowed its existence to register, a silent question hanging over the household and the village's network of observation. Someone, unknown and deliberate, had acted to shape perception and maintain control over information. Thus ended the day's inquiry. The inspector's careful mapping of alibis, timelines, and minor inconsistencies had revealed subtle incongruities, suggesting that appearances in Harrowby Cross were managed as meticulously as domestic arrangements. Beneath the veneer of civility, oversight and influence operated quietly, through indirect action, half-truths, and small discrepancies. Pewbright, seated in the widow's parlour, allowed a single thought to crystallize. Even the most orderly community might conceal purposeful deviation, and the faintest trace, a footprint, a folded corner, a penciled initial, might yet illuminate the hidden logic of social manipulation. The church hall was arranged with the precise care typical of Harrowby Cross. The tables spaced to allow polite conversation without intrusion, the chairs aligned with geometrical exactitude, and a modest display of seasonal decorations carefully chosen to convey festivity without ostentation. Inspector Pewbright arrived just before the scheduled gathering, noting immediately the faint tension beneath the hall's ordered appearance. Parishioners entered in small groups, greeting one another with measured cordiality, each handshake and nod calibrated to maintain reputation and convey the appropriate degree of familiarity. Even the children, present in small numbers, appeared to understand the tacit rules of observation. They whispered, glanced at adults, and avoided behaviors that might attract corrective attention. Miss Cartwright arrived punctually, carrying her clipboard and a collection of letters. Her posture was erect, her expression courteous yet subtly evaluative, as though measuring the extent to which others had observed expected conduct. She inquired delicately about the organization of the tables and the anticipated schedule of the afternoon's minor entertainments. "I trust that arrangements for refreshments have been managed according to the usual standard," she remarked, her tone impeccably neutral, yet carrying a faint implication that deviation, if present, would be noted. Pewbright observed the phrasing, noting its dual function, maintaining politeness while signaling vigilance. Mr. Smallwood appeared shortly thereafter, adjusting his spectacles with the habitual meticulousness of a man attuned to both accuracy and perception. He offered greetings with a slight bow, glanced at the ledger he had brought in an apparent gesture of diligence, and made a general remark concerning the weather's effect on attendance. His statements were cautious, precise, and almost rehearsed, revealing the persistent anxiety that accompanied the stewardship of reputation in a village so attuned to observation. Pewbright noted the interplay of civility and apprehension. Anxiety in Harrowby Cross rarely surfaced in overt expression, yet revealed itself through cadence, choice of phrase, and measured emphasis. A minor discussion arose concerning the placement of the refreshment table. Miss Cartwright suggested a slight adjustment to allow easier access for those seated toward the hall's edges. The adjustment, trivial in content, provoked subtle gestures of assent and hesitation from other attendees. Pewbright observed the social choreography. Agreement and acquiescence were performed with minimal exposure of internal judgment. The act of accommodating a minor change became an arena for measured assertion of influence, revealing both hierarchy and concern for propriety. Mrs. Grimshaw, present in her customary role, offered quiet approval of the arrangement, her calmness serving as a stabilizing counterpoint to the latent tensions among the visitors. Conversation turned to minor parish business, proposed donations, committee decisions, and updates on correspondence. Each participant spoke with a careful blend of deference and assertion. Mr. Bromley recounted visits to the widow's cottage, carefully noting the timing of letters and deliveries, while Miss Cartwright cross-referenced these accounts with her own records. Pewbright noted subtle divergences, small variations in the sequence of visits, the phrasing of statements, and the inclusion or omission of minor details. Such discrepancies, though trivial to the casual observer, provided insight into the underlying social network and the management of appearances. A brief incident drew Pewbright's attention. A slip of paper protruded from beneath a ledger on the refreshment table. Its corner was folded, bearing an impression of writing distinct from any known handwriting in the room. The document, partially obscured, suggested observation and influence beyond the immediately visible participants. Pewbright did not intervene, The note remained in place, an unacknowledged signal whose presence might shape perception subtly and without overt disturbance. The existence of such minor markers reinforced the inspector's growing awareness of a network of indirect oversight operating beneath the veneer of social ritual. As tea and biscuits were served, the pattern of observation continued with quiet precision. Miss Cartwright adjusted cups and plates with meticulous care, subtly managing accessibility and thereby exercising minor influence over the group. Mr. Smallwood commented on minor procedural matters, phrasing observations in the form of questions rather than directives. Yet his choices of emphasis suggested a desire to frame the discussion within boundaries favorable to his perception of propriety. Bromley, conversing softly with a neighbor, offered measured accounts of his own prior visits, carefully avoiding contradiction while implying vigilance over domestic and administrative matters alike. Pewbright noted the layering of observation, statements, gestures, and placements operated in concert to reinforce reputational equilibrium. The conversation took a gentler turn towards social observation. Miss Cartwright inquired about letters recently received by Mrs. Grimshaw, prompting the widow to reference correspondence without disclosing specifics. Every pause, slight hesitation, and turn of phrase carried significance. Politeness coexisted with subtle signaling, revealing both what was permitted to be disclosed and what remained the subject of circumspect concealment. Pewbright's attention to the interplay of statement and silence allowed him to discern patterns of influence, an oversight invisible to those preoccupied with conventional measures of propriety. Late in the afternoon, a small yet revealing event occurred. The maid, carrying additional biscuits from the kitchen, accidentally brushed against the corner of a ledger, displacing a single folded note. Its penciled annotations, brief and indirect, indicated visits and minor interventions not recorded elsewhere. No one remarked upon the incident, yet the shift was sufficient to register in Pewbright's attentive observation. The combination of minor discrepancies, gestures, and indirect evidence suggested the presence of a subtle agent operating within the village's social network, someone influencing perception without direct confrontation. As the gathering concluded, the visitors departed with their customary politeness, offering measured farewells and nods of acknowledgement. The hall, once filled with the delicate tension of observation and oversight, settled into quiet, with only the subtle sound of snow against windows and the faint creak of floorboards signaling residual activity. Pewbright, remaining briefly, examined the room for traces of recent interactions: a displaced chair, the edge of a folded napkin, the precise alignment of a cup. Each minor detail, almost imperceptible to the casual eye, contributed to a pattern of influence and vigilance extending beyond the immediate conversation. Finally, a subtle shift presented itself. The note displaced by the maid bore evidence not merely of observation but of intention. The annotations suggested someone had monitored the scheduling of visits, the sequence of letters, and minor domestic arrangements, managing appearances with deliberate subtlety. Pewbright allowed the evidence to linger in his consciousness, appreciating that in Harrowby Cross, influence and oversight were exercised not through confrontation, but through quiet intervention, through placement, phrasing, and the timing of minor actions. The chapter closed with a single silent question: who had left the note, and to what end had they managed the minutiae of domestic routine? The village, seemingly tranquil under its snow-laden streets, had revealed yet another layer of unseen influence, confirming that appearances in Harrowby Cross could not be taken at face value, and that even the most orderly event might conceal subtle manipulation beyond immediate observation. The morning after the parish event was crisp and still, the snow packed into a firm, reflective crust that rendered every footprint visible. Yet each step seemed to vanish as soon as it was made. Inspector Pewbright walked along the main street, noting the careful measures villagers took to maintain appearances: gloves adjusted, scarves tucked, eyes averted or focused with deliberate neutrality. In Harrowby Cross, even the smallest deviation from expected behavior could ripple through social consciousness, and Pewbright, as always, observed both gesture and hesitation with equal attention. The village, in its meticulous civility, preserved subtle hierarchies and concealed anxieties under a polished exterior. Pewbright began his inquiries with Mr. Smallwood, the treasurer, who welcomed him with measured courtesy and an air of anticipatory explanation. The ledger lay open on the desk, its neat entries punctuated by minor pencil annotations. "I trust you are following the usual lines of investigation," Smallwood remarked, adjusting spectacles with habitual precision, "though it is perhaps more complicated than it first appears." He spoke with careful neutrality, yet Pewbright detected the implicit tension, each word a balancing act between transparency and preservation of reputation. The discrepancies in the ledger, dates misaligned, minor contributions unrecorded, had not escaped Smallwood's awareness, and his tone suggested both anxiety and strategic control over what could be disclosed. Attention shifted naturally to Miss Cartwright, whose arrival was punctuated by polite greetings and a slight bow that suggested formality without distance. She carried a small bundle of letters, their corners crisp, yet with the faint impression of frequent handling. "I thought it prudent," she said softly, "to bring these for your perusal, as there may be matters requiring careful cross-referencing." Her phrasing, formal yet indirect, implied awareness of oversight while avoiding direct accusation. Pewbright noted the subtle layering, the letters themselves, her manner of presentation, and the timing of the visit all conveyed a quiet assertion of influence, the gentle orchestration of appearances within social expectation. The inspector examined the letters with care. Minor inconsistencies in postmarks and penciled marginalia suggested manipulation or at least the selective presentation of information. Pewbright observed that some entries appeared to have been revised after initial recording, likely to reconcile discrepancies between ledger entries and correspondence. Miss Cartwright, observing his scrutiny, offered comments of neutral tone. "I have tried to ensure everything aligns, though one must always allow for human error." The phrasing was impeccable, but the understatement revealed an unspoken acknowledgement. Errors, in Harrowby Cross, often served as instruments of subtle influence rather than mere accident. A brief visit from Mr. Bromley, the retired headmaster, provided additional nuance. He recounted his own movements to the widow's cottage, referencing letters, visits, and minor interactions with characteristic formality. Yet his narrative contained minute contradictions when juxtaposed with prior statements, and the ledger, a visit he described as occurring on the morning of the third day, for instance, conflicted with Miss Cartwright's account of deliveries and with Smallwood's notation of correspondence arrival. Bromley's phrasing remained courteous and precise, yet these discrepancies were more than incidental. They suggested either faulty memory or intentional ambiguity, each plausible within the village's socially regulated conduct. Pewbright then convened a brief informal interview with the widow's maid, who spoke with hesitancy yet remarkable perception. She noted having observed minor movements within the cottage that had gone unrecorded. Letters moved, a ledger adjusted, and visitors whose presence did not appear in official accounts. Her tone was apologetic, yet informative. She had witnessed the operation of a hidden network, subtle and deliberate, managing appearances while preserving civility. Pewbright regarded the observations seriously. Even a timid domestic presence could reveal the otherwise invisible mechanics of social influence in Harrowby Cross. By mid-morning, Pewbright had begun to chart the emerging pattern, minor contradictions in visitor accounts, selective handling of correspondence, and the subtle interventions of an unseen intermediary. Each participant, while adhering to overt civility, exercised influence over perception through timing, phrasing, and selective disclosure. The ledger, letters, and marginalia were not mere records. They were instruments in the quiet negotiation of reputation, wielded with discretion and strategic intent. Even the smallest anomaly, misaligned dates, a displaced letter, a faint fingerprint, suggested purposeful management of both information and appearance. A minor but telling incident occurred when Pewbright returned to the widow's cottage to examine the tea set left from the prior day. A spoon, slightly misaligned from the others, bore a faint smudge inconsistent with any known handling. The placement was deliberate, yet subtle. An indirect signal, perhaps, of recent activity by someone wishing to assert presence or influence without drawing attention. Pewbright noted the sophistication in Harrowby Cross. Influence operated quietly, through gesture, phrasing, and minor adjustments rather than overt confrontation. Each such detail formed part of the village's web of subtle collusion and reputational maintenance. Later, Pewbright revisited Miss Cartwright's correspondence. He compared postmarks with ledger entries, noting additional minor discrepancies. Certain letters, though apparently delivered, had been annotated in ways suggesting delayed acknowledgement or selective revelation. The pattern was consistent. Social behavior in Harrowby Cross was a negotiation, a combination of observation, omission, and subtle signaling. Minor contradictions, when layered across multiple accounts, revealed the presence of coordination, or at least tacit complicity, among villagers in managing appearances, timing, and perception. The chapter concluded with a single, quiet shift. A folded scrap of paper, previously overlooked, tucked beneath the ledger on the sideboard. The handwriting was unfamiliar to Pewbright, the phrasing courteous yet deliberately suggestive, noting events that had not been recorded elsewhere. Its existence implied intervention, observation, and possibly coordination, an invisible agent orchestrating perception, operating without confrontation, yet subtly shaping both narrative and reputation. Pewbright allowed the note to rest in his awareness, recognizing that this quiet instrument might illuminate the hidden structure of influence that governed the village. Thus ended the morning's investigation. Contradictions had emerged, minor collusions were suggested, and the social mechanisms of Harrowby Cross had revealed themselves through gesture, phrasing, and the careful management of information. Pewbright reflected on the subtlety of control exercised by unseen hands and allowed a single, silent question to linger: who had been guiding these interactions behind the veil of civility, and to what end had they exercised their quiet authority over the household and its visitors? The morning light in Harrowby Cross was sharp against the snow-laden roofs, casting long, faintly fractured shadows across streets, meticulously swept of footprints. Inspector Pewbright moved deliberately between cottages, noting how each resident conducted their morning routine with the understated vigilance characteristic of the village. Shutters adjusted precisely, curtains drawn at measured intervals, steps modulated to avoid undue attention. The atmosphere was one of quiet diligence. Civility was maintained as both shield and instrument, preserving appearances while enforcing observation. Even absent confrontation, the architecture of oversight permeated every gesture and expression. Pewbright's first visit was to Mr. Bromley, whose study was tidy, every book aligned, every ledger and memorandum positioned with geometric precision. Bromley greeted him with measured politeness, speaking first of the snow's effect on parish schedules, and then shifting naturally to the sequence of recent visits to the widow Grimshaw. "It appears," he said, "that even minor disruptions in the timing of letters or parcels may influence perception, if one is diligent in observation." His phrasing was formal yet suggestive, implying both the importance of oversight and the potential consequences of oversight's absence. Pewbright, noting Bromley's careful choice of words, recognized the subtle balance of caution, influence, and social expectation at play. The inspector examined Bromley's records alongside his own notes, tracing small divergences between recorded visits and recollections of attendees at the parish event. Bromley's recollections were precise, yet contained pauses and slight hesitations, indicating either memory lapses or the deliberate maintenance of ambiguity. Pewbright noted the intersections of timing and phrasing, minor contradictions, when juxtaposed with ledger entries and letters, suggested either error or subtle management of perception. In Harrowby Cross, even trivial temporal discrepancies could serve as instruments of influence, directing attention, suspicion, and social evaluation without overt intervention. Next, Pewbright visited Miss Cartwright, who received him in her drawing room with characteristic formality. She offered tea with measured attentiveness, her movements precise, her glances controlled. Conversation began with a discussion of correspondence, letters recently received, annotations made in pencil, and the implied responsibilities of intermediaries handling messages between residents. Pewbright observed that Miss Cartwright, while outwardly neutral, employed phrasing designed to elicit acknowledgement of oversight and subtle complicity. "I have tried to ensure that all records are up to date," she said, though one can never fully account for unintended discrepancies. Her tone suggested accountability, yet deflected responsibility for the gaps she highlighted. The discussion gradually shifted to minor contradictions in prior statements. Pewbright inquired delicately about the sequence of letters delivered and visits conducted, and Miss Cartwright enumerated them with careful attention. Yet small divergences emerged, dates that did not align with ledger entries, letters acknowledged but unrecorded, and visits described vaguely or with shifting emphasis. Pewbright recognized the pattern. Social memory, carefully curated, was being managed to balance civility, influence, and reputation. The contradictions were minor, almost imperceptible, but sufficient to suggest a network of deliberate oversight extending beyond the immediately visible actors. A further observation arose from the widow's maid, whose remarks were hesitant but instructive. She had noticed letters and ledgers moved within the cottage, not by Miss Cartwright, Bromley, or Smallwood, but by an unseen hand. Pewbright registered the significance. The village's system of influence extended into domestic space itself, subtle and indirect, shaping perception without confrontation. Even in a household governed by civility and order, interventions could be discreetly enacted to guide understanding, reinforce social norms, or ensure reputational equilibrium. The maid's observations, careful and timid, corroborated the indications of minor discrepancies noted in correspondence and ledgers. Pewbright returned briefly to the widow's cottage, scrutinizing domestic arrangements with the methodical attention characteristic of his style. A misaligned teacup, the slight displacement of a folded letter, and the faint impression of a finger on a ledger page all suggested recent handling by a party unaccounted for in any visitor's log. These subtle interventions reinforced the pattern of influence he had begun to discern: the management of perception through minor actions, phrasing, and positioning rather than through direct assertion. In Harrowby Cross, discretion was a tool of control, and even trivial details were invested with social meaning. Mid-morning brought Mr. Smallwood to the cottage for a brief consultation. He spoke in tones of polite concern, referencing ledger entries, postal discrepancies, and the sequence of visits in a manner that emphasized accuracy without overtly questioning any party. Yet, his phrasing and subtle inflection hinted at awareness of additional, unrecorded activity. Pewbright noted how Smallwood's comments were designed to reinforce observation and influence, yet without alienating anyone present. Civility, in this context, functioned as a medium of reputational control, allowing subtle guidance without overt assertion of authority. A minor, almost imperceptible event punctuated the morning's observations. A folded scrap of paper, previously overlooked beneath the ledger, bore a brief annotation, a note of observation, courteous in tone, recording minor discrepancies in visits and correspondence. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and its presence suggested an unseen participant in the village's system of oversight. Pewbright allowed the detail to register without immediate intervention. It was the quietness of the signal, rather than its content, that marked it as significant. The note implied both presence and influence, confirming that the social fabric of Harrowby Cross contained participants operating discreetly beyond the immediate purview of the principal actors. By afternoon, Pewbright had begun to map the invisible network, minor contradictions in accounts, subtle interventions in correspondence, and deliberate management of domestic routine all pointed toward coordinated oversight. The village's social order was maintained not by explicit enforcement, but through observation, implication, and controlled ambiguity. Each participant, conscious or unconscious, contributed to the regulation of appearances, the mitigation of embarrassment, and the reinforcement of hierarchy. Even trivial actions, misplaced letters, adjusted teacups, the faint impression of a finger, served as instruments of social equilibrium. The chapter concluded with a soft yet telling shift, a brief, deliberate gesture observed in the widow's parlor. As Pewbright arranged letters and checked ledger entries, he noticed the corner of a ledger page subtly lifted, as if to signal prior handling by an unseen party. The motion was slight, almost imperceptible, yet carried all the hallmarks of deliberate intervention. Pewbright understood that the village's hidden network was active, guiding both perception and conduct with quiet authority. A single, silent question lingered: who, beyond the known participants, was shaping these interactions? And with what purpose had they orchestrated the subtle flow of observation, correspondence, and minor contradiction? The answer, like so much in Harrowby Cross, would reveal itself only through patient, meticulous attention. The last light of afternoon fell upon Harrowby Cross with a crisp, crystalline clarity that emphasized both the village's ordered calm and the quiet tensions beneath its surface. Inspector Pewbright returned to the Widow Grimshaw's cottage, his notebook under arm, his eyes attuned to the minutiae that had accumulated over the preceding days: letters, ledgers, annotations, and minor displacements of objects. Each detail, trivial in isolation, now suggested a network of subtle influence and measured oversight, in which civility served both as a shield and as a mechanism of social control. Even the snow outside, firm and reflective, seemed to mirror the village's habit of preserving appearances while tracing the faintest movements of its residents. Mrs. Grimshaw welcomed him with restrained courtesy, as though aware that every gesture, hand on teacup, tilt of head, slight adjustment of her chair, was subject to scrutiny. "I trust your morning has been satisfactory," she said, her voice polite, yet tinged with mild apprehension. Pewbright observed the faint hesitation before she continued, a careful pause that suggested awareness of both prior events and the present audience. He noted how her phrasing served a dual purpose, maintaining civility while subtly signaling the existence of matters unspoken. In Harrowby Cross, silence and implication were as potent as overt expression. The inspector began his review of correspondence, now organized across the table with methodical precision. Letters from tradesmen, parish officials, and distant relatives revealed minor inconsistencies, postmarks misaligned with ledger entries, penciled marginalia not matching known handwriting, and annotations indicating observation or correction by unknown hands. Pewbright's attention was drawn not to the overt content of the letters but to their orchestration, the sequence, the timing, the small adjustments that implied oversight extending beyond immediate participants. Civility, it seemed, had become both instrument and medium of influence. Mr. Bromley arrived shortly thereafter, offering a carefully measured greeting. He referenced minor administrative matters, visits, deliveries, and correspondence, but with phrasing subtly divergent from previous accounts. Dates, durations, and interactions appeared adjusted, refined to maintain propriety while acknowledging oversight. Bromley's hesitations and repetitions were telling. In a village where observation governed social currency, even minor shifts in recollection could serve as tools of reputation management. Pewbright noted the layering of narrative. Statements were calibrated to align appearances with expectation, while simultaneously concealing the full sequence of intervention and influence. Miss Cartwright followed, her arrival punctuated by measured courtesy and precise control of both body and expression. She spoke of parish duties, recent letters, and the timing of deliveries with formal neutrality. Yet, Subtle implications emerged in her phrasing, minor criticisms couched in deferential tone, observations presented as queries rather than statements. Each carefully measured comment revealed awareness of both social expectation and reputational consequences, underscoring the complexity of influence in Harrowby Cross. Pewbright observed how civility, understatement, and implication intertwined to form a network of subtle authority. Together, these interviews allowed Pewbright to chart the emergent pattern, minor contradictions in accounts, selective management of correspondence, and understated interventions within the widow's household. Even seemingly trivial objects, misaligned teacups, a displaced ledger, a folded corner of a note, contributed to a hidden architecture of oversight, revealing deliberate orchestration of perception and influence. The village's social order, he reflected, was not enforced through confrontation but through timing, phrasing, and subtle intervention, with each resident participating knowingly or unconsciously. A quiet revelation arrived in the form of a note previously overlooked beneath the ledger. Its penciled annotations recorded minor observations of visits, correspondence, and domestic activity. The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet the phrasing was courteous and precise, suggesting deliberate attention to both detail and impression. Pewbright regarded the note thoughtfully. It confirmed the presence of an unseen agent, one exercising influence through subtle management rather than open action. Even the smallest interventions, adjusting letters, noting discrepancies, timing visits, formed part of a coordinated network of social oversight. Pewbright reviewed the ledger again, cross-referencing letters, postmarks, and recollections. Discrepancies, minor yet consistent, revealed a deliberate orchestration rather than accidental oversight. Dates had been aligned or misaligned with apparent intent. Annotations suggested anticipation of scrutiny, and previously unnoticed interventions now coalesced into a discernible pattern. Civility, phrasing, and gesture were instruments by which influence was asserted and reputational equilibrium maintained. The village, though outwardly tranquil, had quietly revealed its underlying architecture of control and observation. The chapter's final subtle shift occurred as Pewbright noticed a faint impression on the underside of a folded note, a trace of handwriting, partial yet distinct, indicating handling by a party previously unaccounted for in his interviews. The presence of the mark suggested a deliberate effort to guide perception without confrontation, to assert influence quietly within the household. Pewbright's observation did not require immediate action. The signal, minor as it was, illuminated the final thread in the pattern he had been tracing. Oversight, influence, and subtle coordination were active in the village, operating beneath the surface of civility and awaiting further revelation through patient observation. As the afternoon light dimmed, casting long shadows across the snow-laden streets, Pewbright reflected on the intricate orchestration of behavior, correspondence, and domestic detail he had observed. The residents of Harrowby Cross, in their polite vigilance, had created a web of subtle influence, contradictions, and interventions that maintained reputational balance while shaping perception. The village's social machinery had become visible, yet its operators remained largely hidden, their influence enacted quietly, deliberately, and effectively. And so the chapter closed, with a single silent question lingering in Pewbright's mind: who beyond the known actors had guided the minor interventions, and to what end had they exercised their quiet authority over letters, visits, and observation? The answer, as always in Harrowby Cross, promised revelation only to those who attended patiently to the faintest of signs, the smallest gestures, and the careful orchestration of civility itself.